Welcome all, and thanks for tuning in to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. My name is Chris Hayton. You're listening to part 3 and our final episode of the Raw Materials and Ingredients Supplier segment. In this episode, I chat with Research and Development Associate Avi Shayevitz from Lallemand Brewing over in Canada. An avid homebrewer and a passion for the science behind the brewing process, having a master's degree in food science, Avi dives into the important considerations in regards to yeast that breweries need to get their head around in the commercial world of brewing. We talk about the role yeast plays in the brewing process, handling of yeast in a commercial sense, building a relationship with your yeast supplier, dry yeast versus liquid yeast, and we also discuss how breweries can set their beers apart by developing their own unique house strains. So without further delay, I hope you all enjoy my chat with Avi Shayevitz from Lallemand Brewing. Well, welcome, Avi, to the Build Me Brewery podcast. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Thanks for having me.
And how we got in contact, Dan McCulloch recommended some of his colleagues to talk about the yeast aspect, which you guys are making a very big name for yourselves in the brewing industry for ingredients, especially on the yeast and adjunct side of things. And he put us in touch with Eric, one of the global technical managers, and then Tobias, and then we've landed on you being the expert to talk about yeast. So really excited to get your thoughts about all the different aspects a commercial brewer needs to be considering in the handling of yeast, the sourcing of yeast, and talking about a few other aspects regarding yeast management and propagation programs, which I'm quite interested to hear about as well. But before we get into that, mate, always like to get to know the guest a bit more and just talk about your humble beginnings, how you came to where you are right now, and craft beer roots, any home brewing stories. Take it away, mate.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. So it was really during my undergrad. So a little background for that is I had originally started, I went to school in Michigan for college, and my background is in chemical biology. My original intention was supposed to get into paleontology, kind of a far cry different than than brewing microbiology. And I had completed that and was working in the petrochemical industry for a couple of years, and I decided this really isn't for me. And I got involved with a mycology group, this local science group that's started at my university, and that's how I kind of got into food science. And then from there, I decided to look into different programs for graduate school. But rather than jumping directly into graduate school, I decided to do a post-baccalaureate degree, which is basically a second bachelor's degree in food science. And from there, I moved from Michigan to Oregon and started at Oregon State University. And that's where I met several like-minded individuals, all of whom I still keep in contact with today, including my girlfriend, who is currently still stuck in the United States as I am in Canada. We started this little homebrewing club at school, and it was from there. Like, originally we just kind of used it as an excuse to socialize during the warm summer nights in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, but it very quickly ended up turning into something pretty competitive. So about 3 or 4 months into our homebrewing escapades, we were attempting to go head to head with much older, much more established, and arguably much better run homebrewing clubs and local competitions. And through either sheer luck or blunt force, we've managed to place in several homebrewing competitions, including, and I'm very proud of this accomplishment, we were able to get the silver for our Dunkelweiss at the National American Homebrewing Association competition. So that was a lot of fun. And then after I had graduated, after I finished my second bachelor's degree, I ended up getting into the graduate program at Oregon State for food science, and I was working mostly on looking at the microbiome of barrel-aged beer and complex fermentation using modern computational or modern biocomputing techniques like bioinformatics. And so from there, my interest only grew. So I started getting more and more involved with the industry itself. I started doing some consultations for local breweries in Oregon who were looking to start barrel aging programs. I got to work very closely with already established breweries that had extensive barrel aging programs, just trying to find ways to kind of study the local flora and fauna of the Willamette Valley of Oregon and how that impacts lambic style beers, because there's this belief that there's this kind of like microbial terroir, so to speak. So traditional lambic brewers will tell you that you can only get a lambic from the Seine Valley in Belgium. But modern data is kind of showing that that may not actually be the case. What's probably happening is it's more just related to the wort itself that's kind of enriching for these very specific organisms. So this has been like super interesting area of work for me, and doing my graduate study in that was fantastic. So from there, after completing the food science degree program at Oregon State, I stayed on for graduate school and started working in our brewing microbiologist lab. And our primary area of study was looking at the barrel aging microbiome of lambic style beers. So specifically beers that were brewed and fermented within the Willamette Valley and the Central Oregon area, to take a look at how barrel aging will affect the microbiome of those complex fermentations. It was uncharted territory at the time, because this is taking a super in-depth look into these complex fermentations using modern computational biology. So we're like looking right down at the DNA composition of these populations and determining like population distributions from there and how it changes over time. So this was a long-term study. And then from there, doing that, I had gotten in touch with a lot of breweries within Oregon, and I did some consultation on the side in terms of like helping breweries start barrel aging programs, best ways or best practices for developing or almost like training your barrels for future aging projects. And it was about that time I also had started working for Anheuser-Busch in their craft division called the High End at the time, which I believe now it's called the Brewers Collective, where I worked as a product development brewer for a while. And then as my tenure with them was ending, I ended up getting a call from my now supervisor, Tobias Fishborn, who had gotten my resume from a mutual contact and asked me if I wanted to interview for an R&D position at Lallemand. And I jumped at the chance because now I actually get to work with the actual yeast.
Yeah, well, so very much as you would expect, a very scientific driven background there to where you've come to, and it even great to have that passion and hobby on the homebrewing side. I guess that's sort of led you to where you're currently at in the industry. And any particular favorite breweries or beer styles at all? I mean, you've been an international guest to the show. Love to hear about some of the breweries that have inspired you, or the ones that you always pop in and have a beer if you're in town. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So it's always hard to narrow that down, but one thing I can always remember is whenever I think of my favorite beer and style, there's a beer that's available in the Pacific Northwest that comes from Washington State called Rainier. And that will always hold a special place in my heart, because every time we homebrewed, we would always have a case of Rainier. And it's just like your simple, clean macro lager that, it just really hits the spot on a hot day. But my favorite brewery of all time, and I'm definitely going to take this opportunity to plug it. If you ever find yourself in Portland, Oregon, there's this great little brewery called Great Notion Brewing, and they are just known for some of the wildest beers that you'll have. They do make their flagship standard IPAs, but they do all kinds of these bizarre experimental beers. One of which has gained such notoriety and / popularity that they're now canning it. But it's a blueberry muffin beer.
Oh, wow.
And it tastes like, I think it's called it's called the blueberry muffin sour. But it tastes like a bakery muffin. It is unreal.
Jeez.
So that is a great example of a brewery that is able to do it right. And they don't really have any intentions of getting much bigger than they are. So it kind of fits their business model because it's like, it's not really something you could mass produce on a large
No,
scale, but
that's what I'm also noticing is, yeah, it's like how viable is that recipe on a commercial scale? So yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
right? Like you don't want to charge someone $12 for a can.
No, no. But okay, great. So predominantly you're providing consultative advice to the brewing industry on the yeast side. Is it just purely yeast, or is there other sort of aspects that you cover?
We also do bacteria as well. So souring or sour pitches for traditional sour beers. But it is for the most part Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we had Dan and Richard from Lallemand here in Australia come on the podcast talking about the quality aspect. Whole reason having you on, Avi, as I mentioned earlier, is talking about the yeast aspect. Go into a bit more detail about your role with Lallemand in relation to yeast.
Absolutely. So I actually did listen to that podcast, and they did a great job explaining the importance of quality aspects in yeast management. So getting those fundamentals is a great way to start. So my role, I'm slightly separate from that aspect of yeast management within Lallemand. However, I do work pretty closely with the quality assurance team members as well as the sales force out in the field because we rely on the sales team to kind of they're almost like our eyes and ears out in the field to see what customers want, what they expect, looking at trends, just keeping notes for us. So my relationship with them is specifically to spearhead new developments in emerging market trends, as well as maintaining and helping these existing trends within the industry at large. So, for instance, one of the major projects that I've been working on is, that we're constantly working on, is development of new fermentation aids, or nutrients. So these are products that need to be fully optimized for their applications, and it's because yeast is such a like when we talk about yeast from a microbiology point of view, yeast is any single-celled fungus. In brewing world, when we talk about yeast, we're talking specifically about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and even within Saccharomyces, or even within the S. cerevisiae species, there's a huge variation. I mean, we're looking at, you're talking about an organism where you can have as much as 30% genetic variation between strains, and they're still the same species. And when we think about that, like, I mean, look at humans and chimpanzees, right? Like, we differ by about 2.5% of our DNA. So you get like a huge variation within just one relatively small species and a huge clade of single-celled fungus. So it could be very difficult to kind of manage that, but that's kind of what makes it so exciting because now we can just take a look at what we have and how they react under different situations. What I do is how can we help customers find a way to use a yeast that they like for a fermentation that it probably wasn't originally intended for.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because I've said it on a lot of other episodes, and yeast, in my sort of opinion, is probably one of the more or most important ingredients in the whole beer brewing process. Without yeast, you don't have beer, and I really do think it's responsible for the final flavor and aroma and mouthfeel of a beer. And what I'm learning through some of the experts that I'm meeting with, Dan being one of the TAFE teachers here in New South Wales, I'm learning a lot from him as well. And I also had Neil Cameron on the podcast in an earlier segment on brewery consulting and quality management. And, he believes yeast will take over from hops as the next big, exciting trend, driving new flavors and aromas in the craft beer space in Australia. Do you agree with that statement? Is that something you're hearing in other parts of the world?
Absolutely. There's a ton of potential there. So I'm a huge fan of yeast, both as an avid beer drinker and as a food scientist. And I believe that this really includes the potential for yeast. And mind you, I'm using the word potential here for any hop growers out there, but it has the potential to completely phase out hops entirely.
Wow. Bold statement.
Very bold. But, and a huge but here, that technology is always the mythical, 5 years away. And honestly, I don't see that happening fully because hops themselves it's a super interesting plant too, incredibly genetically diverse as well. So I don't ever see hops disappearing, but I do see that yeast will begin to play a much more prominent role in actively flavoring and boosting hop flavors. There's a lot of regulatory aspects involved in developing and marketing novel yeast for brewing or for food applications, particularly because you have to deal with your government regulatory commissions. So that'd be like in the United States, that would be the FDA. If it's a new species or something, you'd have to ensure that it's generally recognized as safe, that other countries allow it, so you can export your beers, things like that. But that's an entirely different topic. But there's a lot of tradition and dogmatism to also overcome too, because brewers tend to be very dogmatic, and that's one of the most endearing things about them. Like I myself, I find myself following rules that I learned very early on that I don't really know where they came from. It's just because that was the tradition. That's who the person who taught me to brew brewed. But being able to overcome some of those traditional aspects and some of that dogmatism, that will play a big role, especially if bioengineering starts to become more and more prevalent. And I bring that topic up because when I was living in Oregon, I left Oregon in 2019, and 2020 was the single worst year for wildfires that Oregon had seen in, I think, like 40 years as a direct result of climate change. And this is something that's going to be happening more and more often. And even within the 6 years that I was living in Oregon, living and working in Oregon, hop farms had to adapt and they had to change just on a yearly basis because weather was getting too hot or it was getting too wet in some areas. That would impact the biochemistry of the hops themselves. So you can get a huge variation from year to year. So I think that yeast definitely has that potential to offset a lot of those changes that the agriculture side of the brewing industry is going to start facing as as summers get hotter.
So basically, what you're saying is it's a more controlled product, and you don't have the uncontrollable impacts of changing weather. Is what you're saying?
In a sense, yeah, because it's kind of removed from that variable. You can brew yeast, or you can propagate yeast no matter how hot it is outside.
Yeah.
You can even there's plenty of methods for developing new strains using non-GMO techniques as well, and you can also get much more scalpel precise changes with GMO techniques. I believe Dan talked about it in the US market. We released our Sour Visier, which is a genetically modified Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain, which has a single gene cassette insert that allows it to produce prodigious amounts of lactic acid. And it's a very clean lactic acid taste, and it's something that can be that can be controlled downstream. Once you produce your beer, you do some high gravity brewing, and then you can kind of dilute it down. We're also seeing much more in terms of bioengineering in the pharmaceutical industries, which holds a lot of potential for the food industry as well. You can get yeast to produce all kinds of compounds for extraction. So you can get like previously super expensive compounds much cheaper because they're a lot cheaper to produce. And that's actually been a big point of study in several universities in the United States, particularly like University of California in Davis, Berkeley Group. There's a couple of biotech companies specifically designed around the idea of trying to produce yeast that will produce hop terpenes or even cannabinoids. So definitely a lot of potential there.
Yeah, it seems to be a very unexplored area in the brewing industry in regards to interesting and new and exciting beers. Like I feel like the hops thing is, well, it sounds like everyone's tried every different thing you can do with hops. Might be wrong in saying everything, but it seems like Australia has well and truly adopted the hop craze. And so, yeah, it's interesting to explore the idea of where yeast can maybe take the evolution of craft beer or beer in general. So, but for aspiring brewery owners, talking about what they should know about yeast, it is a complex organism and product to sort of get your head around. But in the commercial brewing world, are you able to talk to us a bit about what are some things that aspiring brewery owners and even established brewery owners should be, I guess, considering on that aspect? So contracts with yeast suppliers like Lallemand, yeast management, the storage and care of it, pitching rates, dry yeast versus liquid yeast, repitching practices. I know I just dropped a whole heap of different topics on there, but you sort of get an idea of where I'm coming from, of what angles I'm trying to explore to sort of share with the audience.
Absolutely. So as for contracts with brewing with yeast suppliers, that's not really something I'm familiar with, because for me, it seems like that's more on the supplier side of things rather than like the actual production company. However, that being said, one thing that I really enjoy and that I highly encourage is that even if you're not using Lallemand yeast, whatever brand of yeast you use, build a relationship with that company. Reach out to them, and they're more times than not, they're more than happy to oblige requests or collaborations, things like that. We're always Lallemand itself, like we're always working with local breweries for trying new yeast strains, particularly with. So one of the things I can think of off the top of my head from a launch that occurred when I was starting was our Verdant IPA yeast. Prior to its launch, this is something that we worked closely with local Canadian breweries and UK breweries to kind of help finalize this project. And if you establish a relationship with whatever yeast supply company or yeast production company you're using, you can go a long way in kind of getting on board with stuff like that. And it's a great experience because one, everybody loves it, and it helps the bottom line of the brewery itself because they generally don't have to pay for supplies. The people at the company really enjoy it because they typically get beer out of it. So and as for yeast management, storage, care, so that really falls under the individual brewery practices. So what works for one brewery may not necessarily be ideal for others. But one of the great things about developing these relationships with your yeast suppliers or yeast companies is that you can often get services for things like long-term yeast storage banks. So if you are an established brewery and you have a very particular strain that you like, if you have a good relationship with a yeast company, they will typically make an agreement with you to store a sample of that yeast, like a cryogenic sample, so it'll just remain unchanged, effectively forever. So you will always have like essentially like a doomsday backup for if your yeast propagation system got contaminated and everything was ruined, you can go back and get your original strain. So that's definitely something to consider, is talking about things like yeast storage facilities or capabilities. I know like at the Siebel Institute, which is owned by Lallemand, that's one of the services that they provide, at least for breweries in North America. I think like anybody, no matter where you're located in the world, can do it. It's just you just got to think about the logistics of how you want it stored and where you want it shipped, because everything is kind of shipped either to Chicago or Montreal, I believe.
Right. Okay. But in an actual physical brewery, maybe not for the early day new
Mhm.
breweries, might not be within their budget, but you hear about standard care practices or management of handling of yeast. And you also hear about propagation programs that certain breweries have to develop their own unique strains.
Mhm.
Any sort of comments around that?
Yeah. So especially in the early days, and this is where I strongly advocate for dry yeast applications. It's because if you're just getting started, having a storage of dry or having a cache, sorry, of dry yeast on hand is great because at that point, if you have a brick of yeast, you're pretty much ready to go. So that cuts down storage space immensely. And then on top of that, you can also use that as a seed for the propagation system that you have in place. So it's very flexible in that sense. No matter how you propagate your yeast, having a cache of dry yeast on hand is a great way to get started because if stored properly, you don't even have to use the whole brick. You can just kind of take off a little bit, re-vacuum seal it, and store it under cold conditions. So that'll last for 3-4 years on the shelf if left properly cared for.
Mm.
Now, as for like individual brewery practices, I know repitching is another very popular aspect, and when done right, it's very efficient, very cost effective, and time saving. So for something like that, that is more about developing SOPs for your individual system and for your individual brewery. But it's very flexible. And I can say that the American Society of Brewing Chemists and the European Brewing Convention both have extensive SOPs or methodologies in place for performing things like repitching and storage.
Now, you mentioned about pitching rates. So a lot of people listening, probably from home brewing backgrounds, there's probably a number of commercial brewers listening in as well. A lot of them know that depending on the volume you're brewing and the gravity of your wort will depend on your pitching rate.
Yes.
Yeah. So if someone's doing a commercial batch, so let's say 2,000 litres worth, it's a big difference to just grabbing a couple of packets from your home brewing shop and just chucking them in your fermenter. How does, on a commercial level, if someone's not storing it at their facility, I've heard that there's contracts with yeast suppliers where they tell them, that they're in sync with their production schedule, and they say, okay, we need this yeast to be grown to this amount of yeast cells by this brew day. Is that something that happens in the industry? They will sort of start growing that yeast count in anticipation for their brew day. Is that how it works?
I can imagine that would be something that liquid yeast providers could do.
Yep.
It's not unheard of. I've never personally encountered something like that.
It's just in my research, I was just coming across some services that provide that. Yeah, like you said, that's probably more on the liquid side, and without sort of skipping over that question about pitching rates, but just quickly, what your opinion, dry yeast versus liquid yeast? What is your preferred type of yeast?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, from a Lallemand perspective, I have to say dry yeast.
Dry yeast.
But
is Lallemand only in the dry yeast aspect? They don't do any of the liquid stuff?
So we don't commercially sell liquid stuff.
Right.
But that I was going to go back to your question about contacting or getting suppliers to kind of produce like a certain level of creamy or like liquid broth for brew days, because that is something that the Siebel Institute does. They will prepare carboys of yeast, of liquid yeast specifically for direct pitching of specific. So this goes back to the yeast storage bank, the cryogenic storage bank. So some breweries will request to have like a specific level or a specific density of cells for pitching purposes in what we call a cream yeast, which is basically, it's just a very thick liquid yeast. But the primary difference between dry and liquid yeast is each one has its own advantages and disadvantages. So they're both very versatile. For one thing, dry yeast has a much longer shelf life and is much more stable, so that there's a huge advantage there. However, liquid yeast tends to have a much shorter lag phase, just because you already have active yeast that are metabolically, they're metabolically active. They don't really have to adapt, or they don't have to undergo the same level of adaptation that basically yeast in suspended animation has to do. But there's this long-standing myth that for whatever reason, dry yeast produces an inferior product. And I mean, maybe 20, 30 years ago, that could have been true, but I feel like that's just kind of like anecdotal evidence of somebody pulling a jar of instant rise baker's yeast off a shelf and trying to make beer with it. We have the evidence to back up that dry yeast is just as effective or it produces the same quality product that liquid yeast does.
Yeah, and that's something that I recently came across as well. And exactly what you said there, maybe 20, 30 years ago, like you said, there were some significant quality differences. But dry yeast, I mean, that's all I ever use on a homebrewing scale. I've done a few little liquid sort of pitches and rehydration type stuff, but dry yeast just seems more convenient, and especially for a commercial level, like you're saying, the storage of it and the shelf life of it and the management isn't as tedious as what it would be with the liquid side.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a bit about repitching,
Hmm.
and this is definitely a gap in my learning because I'm not someone that sort of reuses yeast on a homebrewing level. It's something I've looked at exploring, but haven't really got round to. But people reusing yeast, maybe talk a bit about that on a commercial level. Breweries doing that.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a time honored, time honed practice. And it's a very important aspect for brewing consistency. Actually, my girlfriend, she works for Molson Coors, and when she started working there, part of her training was she had to go into the lager tanks to squeegee out the yeast for repitching.
Oh, right.
So it is done at a large scale. I mean, literally metric tons of yeast. So when done correctly, repitching, like I said, it offers a significant time saving and honestly money advantage. So this is something that I think that all breweries should at least explore doing, especially if you're starting out, because it's just a great way to kind of build up that consistent brand as well. And this kind of goes back to the myth of that, surrounding dry yeast versus liquid yeast, because a lot of people are kind of under the impression you can't repitch dry yeast. But once the beer is done, once it's fermented, it's still an active slurry of yeast. It's going to ferment if you put it into something else, and it's going to ferment pretty much the same way, barring any major issues that you had during fermentation. But there are a few things to consider when looking at a repitching practice. So you want proper storage. One of the ways that I myself would store yeast for repitching when I was doing product development was I would store it in a keg. I would use little kegs, but you can use like a standard, what is that, like, how big are they? They're like half a barrel, right? So that would be
Well, over this way it'd be 50 liters a keg.
50 liters.
Yep.
Yeah, because I'm thinking in US gallons.
Barrels,
So
yeah. You bloody Yanks like to
yeah,
confuse it, the metric system, yeah.
I used much smaller, so I used basically a quarter barrel keg for storage yeast because I didn't brew at the same scale. I was only doing like maybe 4 hectoliters at a time, and so storing in a keg under slight pressure. So we're talking like maybe 5 psi above atmospheric. So it doesn't have to be like under super pressure. And this isn't necessarily because it's like super ideal for the yeast to store under those conditions, but it's more like to maintain the environment that the yeast were living in prior to pulling it off. So what this does is it's essentially keeping the yeast in the same kind of biological reference frame to start producing the next batch of beer. So this helps reduce stress and a shock factor that may result in inconsistent fermentations. The other things to consider are the nutrition and overall health of the culture. So one thing that we're constantly looking at, like I said earlier, is yeast nutrition and kind of optimizing yeast health for fermentations. So nutrient additions prior to repitching does go a long way in just helping maintain the overall health of the yeast. So this can be done just by prepping a couple kegs ahead of time, the kegs that you're going to be collecting your yeast slurry into, by just priming it with, a little bit of yeast nutrient. You don't need as much. I would say like even cut in half or maybe a quarter of what you would use for a normal fermentation. Load it up with some sterile water into the keg, just a little bit, and then move the yeast into the keg and just give it a good mix. So that nutrient will go a long way to just helping the overall biological reference frame, or the biological stability of that. Because by the time you collect your yeast, they're in a part of their cell cycle where they're just kind of like in maintenance mode. At that point, they're not really reproducing. They're sort of just kind of metabolizing slowly and just kind of overall just maintaining their cellular structure. And by providing that little teeny extra boost of nutrient, that kind of gives them the nitrogen and the vitamins that they need to just kind of help maintain that if you're storing it for long term. I would never store it longer for 5 days. So if I wasn't using a yeast after 5 days, I would just empty the keg and start again if I wasn't repitching. That's just kind of a rule of thumb that I developed because I noticed anything beyond that, you kind of started seeing higher and higher lags in fermentation and lower attenuation efficiency. So that's the other thing too. It's like just kind of keeping track of fermentations and collating your data as simple as something is on a spreadsheet, just an Excel spreadsheet, so you can easily spot trends for the longevity of the yeast itself. One last thing that I do like to talk about, especially when people ask about repitching, is to consider the beer that the yeast came from and the beer that the yeast is going into. If there's too much of a variant in if there's too much of a variant in the sugar profile of the beer, you could shock your yeast going into it, kind of maybe inducing some kind of off flavors, or just a lower efficiency beer. So like, I mean, if you're going from a 8 Plato Pilsner into a 20 Plato double mocha chocolate stout pastry puff beer.
That sounds amazing.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. I actually do enjoy a pastry stout every now and then.
Can't say I've ever had one, but I'm looking forward to the day. I hear that they're an absolute bastard to make, though.
Yeah. Oh my God. Some of the questions I get. But if a brewery can pull it off, it's basically drinking a liquid cake. I would.
Wow.
But yeah, like something like that. That's an extreme example, but that could affect how the yeast behaves going into a fresh tank. So generally, a lot of breweries that I've worked with, when they're repitching, they generally repitch into similar beers. So like one IPA to another, one pale ale to another, one lager to another. These will adapt. They're robust to an extent.
Now, I've been interested in the idea of exploring how a brewery can set its beers apart. And I know we talked a little bit earlier about yeast management and propagation programs. It's becoming an ever increasing competitive craft beer space here in Australia, and I'm sure it is in a lot of different areas of the world. But I guess breweries typically all have access to the same types of malts and hops.
Mhm.
However, yeast is what I've been led to believe is what can create that X factor and that uniqueness for a brewery's beers, where they can develop their own unique house culture strains through the yeast propagation management programs. Is this something that you can talk a bit more about, and how even new breweries or established breweries, those that want to become innovative and create different twists on that style that they're looking at trying to achieve? Are you able to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to, because that is definitely a growing area of interest for a lot of brewers. So these are some questions that I have received in the past, which I found very interesting. And the more research that I do into it, it's like the more I'm learning about like the industry as a whole, and it's not really such a niche thing anymore. So I'm a firm believer of brand building. So having a solid, consistent beer that's what keeps people coming back. So I mean, I'm definitely not a marketing expert, but as a consumer, I make my choices based upon what I like. One thing that I constantly hear is, "Will you buy a 6 pack of that?" That's a good litmus test for myself. And I will absolutely try a brewery seasonal beer or a one-off recipe, and even be like super forgiving if it's just awful, because what's going to keep me coming back is that particular brewery's pale ale or that brewery's lager, or stout, or whatever style you happen to enjoy. So you can think of it as a kind of a positive feedback loop. Consistency leads to consistency, and especially if you're repitching and taking care of your yeast and you're taking care of your culture collection, over time you're going to start actively artificially selecting for your own kind of particular house yeast. So we go back to the fact that like it's not as much as a niche trend as I originally thought, because there are loads of breweries, at least in the U.S. that I know of, that are having their house strains sequenced. They're getting the actual genetic data on that. So they can see how it compares to the overall family tree of brewing yeast. And the brewing yeast family tree is incredibly diverse. Like, we have established populations and subpopulations that you can see diverged as people kind of like migrated and colonized other areas of the world. So you have like the US strains, which diverged from the UK strains. You have sake strains that are native to Southeast Asia, like Korea, parts of China and Japan. And a lot of like the Australian strains are also heavily related to the US strains and the UK strains. So this has been a big boon to bioinformatics as well, especially like food bioinformatics, because we have all these breweries actively taking part in this. It's a gigantic study. So now we're able to kind of like trace like lineage divergence and how long it could possibly take for like a separate brewery to kind of like artificially select for their own strain. And the best part is like this technology is just getting cheaper. For less than $1,000, you can have like your entire culture collection sequenced. This was something like 20 years ago would have cost, or hell, even like 25 years ago, would have cost like almost $1 million to do.
Wow.
So this is really super interesting in that bioprospecting is starting to become a thing. Breweries are actively looking for their own strain or even their own species. One of our most recent releases was the Philly Sour, which is a novel Lachantia species, which is normally associated with woody plants like vineyards, like vines and trees. And this was isolated from a graveyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, by a research scientist that worked at the University of Sciences in Philadelphia, who decided that, he got in touch with Lallemand and wanted to see if we wanted to work with them to develop this new strain, this new species for brewing applications, and it led to a new product. But it makes for a great story, and there's absolutely no reason why an individual brewery can't do that.
Yeah, well, I know for a fact that there's very unique beers to the Australian beer industry, like Cooper's, for instance, been around for 100 plus years. They actually, I might be mistaken here, but from what I know is they have their very own unique house strain that's been going back for generations and decades and decades. And you could be given the exact recipe at a homebrewing level to make that beer. But if you don't have that particular house strain, it won't come close to a Cooper's, is what I'm learning.
Yep.
So, and that is, I guess, how breweries not only can make themselves unique, but protect the proprietary product, or so no one's sort of creating these copycat versions of their beers. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. One of the best examples I can think of too is this brewery out in the UK called Harvey's, which I've only had their beer a couple times, but this was introduced to me by a colleague of mine, and yeah, it's a British stout, and it's unlike any stout that I've ever tasted. And honestly, there'd probably be no way for me to replicate that without having their particular species of yeast or whatever organism they're fermenting with. I mean, it may very well even be Brettanomyces. I don't know. But it's a really good stout, and I know people. I was looking it up online, and people have been trying to crack the code of how to make their own Harveys. So yeah, exactly. It's like Cooper's. You establish a system and you stick to it, and eventually, yeah, that's going to lead to kind of like this divergence. Now, granted, it's not going to happen overnight, but I would say a workaround of that is actively bioprospecting. So that's like going out into the wild, taking cultures, swabbing things, seeing what you can grow in the lab, and trying to brew with them.
Yeah, no, it sounds, by the way we're talking about it, very complex. But like you said, if you've got a good relationship with your yeast supplier or producer, ask
Mhm.
these sort of questions and start thinking about it. Maybe not for a 12-month-old brewery, but at least having to think about it. And like I said, it's becoming an ever increasing competitive market, especially here in Australia. In the US, bloody hell, you guys leave us for dead in terms of how many breweries there are. But in Australia, for breweries to separate their beers, it sounds just like what Neil was saying about his comment about yeast being the next big thing. Yeast-driven beers is the most unexplored area, and it's probably the most crucial ingredient. And if yeast isn't working properly, it's not happy. It's doesn't matter how many hops or good quality malts you put in, yeast is going to slap them away and produce a shonky beer if you don't look after your yeast. Yeah. So, well, no, that a lot of great insight there, mate, and really appreciate you sharing some of that with us. And unique thing about where you're situated, being I guess, an international guest of the show, being based in Canada. I've been getting a lot of guests who are based here in Australia talk about the Australian industry for beer and craft beer, but talk to us about some of the beer trends that you're seeing in some of the regions that you work, particularly any yeast-driven beers that you're seeing hitting the market these days. Yeah, you able to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, let me see. I could jump pretty much directly into a global perspective almost because I feel like that this would definitely have an impact on the Australian craft beer market as well. And it's mostly based off of inquiries that I've received from customers, colleagues, and just people who find me on LinkedIn. But I think we're going to start seeing a fundamental shift in the industry focus. And this is mostly because this has kind of been like slowly burning for the last few years. And it's like you said, in markets like the United States, where it's just super saturated. I mean, so many breweries out there right now. But with COVID-19, that kind of accelerated these changes. And this is particularly in how smaller breweries are starting to operate, especially if they're looking to open up like in the next few years. So we're going to see some long-term implications just by virtue of how interconnected we are globally. So I think the breweries are definitely going to start diversifying their portfolios, especially their brand portfolios, at a much higher rate than what we've seen. Breweries are going to now probably start following trends a lot closer. And I mean, the big three, the big breweries out there, the big boys, Constellation Brands, Anheuser-Busch, Heineken, they're pushing very hard to get into launching hard seltzer brands into 2020 or in 2021. And then we have some of the larger craft beer producers like Boston Beer is has had a line out for like I think the last 2 years already. White Claw is a huge competitor.
Yeah, well, you're seeing those guys over here, White Claw. Yep.
Yep. And we're starting to see that trend really take off in the US and in Canada. Our producers want, or breweries want to start producing non-beer products, but they still want to do it the same way that they produce beer. So that's something that we help with is these brewers that want to kind of take these novel approaches, but still kind of maintaining that same brewery mystique, which I think is great. I think as long as beer doesn't go away, I'm all for trying these non-beer applications, hard seltzers in particular, near beers, non-alcoholic beers. That's starting to become way
Yeah,
more
it is.
popular. But we're just going to see more and more breweries opting into non-beer options, non-alcoholic options, higher sustainability options that are less reliant on the current supply chain model. And as an ingredient supplier, like it's our job to kind of be on top of that. One of the big things actually is biotransformation. That's kind of like the hot buzzword at the moment. Everybody's talking about biotransformation. And biotransformation, in brief, is basically that's what happens during fermentation. You're using biological processes to transform raw materials into a new material. So fermentation is technically a biotransformation, but in this case, biotransformation is specifically talking about yeast enzymatic activity on hops. So yeast will produce a large number of enzymes during its lifespan, and these enzymes are meant to basically free up either sugar or amino acids from various substrates. And these substrates can come from the hops, they can come from the malt, they can come from adjuncts that you add, and the activity of these enzymes can greatly influence the flavor of beer. And what we're finding is that some strains of yeast have higher activity for specific enzymes that have a high affinity for these compounds in hop material. And because of that, you're basically freeing up a what's known as a glycoside or a glycosidically bound compound, which is a volatile organic compound that is attached to a sugar. And while it's attached to the sugar, it can't volatilize. So it's essentially invisible to taste and smell. But once the enzyme cuts off that sugar molecule, that other molecule is now free to volatilize off into the air. So you can taste it, you can smell it. And what we're seeing is that some strains of yeast are actually much more effective at kind of boosting hop aromaticity than others. So I think the other big trend that we're starting to see are people actively looking for those kinds of yeast that they can use in a dry hopped beer or in an IPA or just something that just kind of help boost or change those flavors and those aromas.
All right. And talk to us a bit about some of the new products that have hit the market and, that are available to brewers, both home brewers and commercial brewers. Are you able to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Actually, so a couple that I believe are available globally now. One of them is our Aromazyme product. This is sort of an artificial way to kind of recreate those yeast enzymes or those enzymatic reactions. So even if you're not brewing with a strain of yeast that is particularly fecund in producing these enzymes, you can add Aromazyme, which is a fungal derived glucosidase, to help boost hop aroma. So this is something that you can add either during fermentation or after fermentation. You just have to be aware that, like, yeah, it's freeing up sugar. So you may see a little bit of ethanol creep just due to a slight boost in activity. The other big thing was the Philly Sour, which I mentioned. That's our most recent yeast release. This is a non-Saccharomyces brewing yeast that is specifically meant for producing sour beers. So this comes from it's a novel species of Lachantia that was isolated from, like I said, from a tree in a graveyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it is very good at producing lactic acid. And the really interesting thing is that the flavors that it produces seems to be dependent on the amount of glucose that's available. So if it's a high adjunct beer, so if you have a beer with, say, that's been like fortified with a little bit of glucose syrup, you tend to get more like stone fruit or more peach aromas and flavors. Whereas if it's mostly or 100% malt based, you tend to get more like fleshy fruit, like star fruit or apple flavors and aromas, kind of like a honey crisp apple. I don't know if that's descriptive enough, but it's really cool because even though it has been launched, we're still learning a lot about it because this is something that I'm just constantly keeping an eye on. And this goes back to establishing relationships with your yeast supplier or yeast companies. I'm constantly in touch with breweries all over the world that are using this just to get their feedback and see what they're doing. I can't name any names, but we've had some really good examples of low alcohol beer produced with Philly Sour. And that's mostly because not only does it produce a lot of lactic acid, it also produces a lot of glycerol. So if you're doing like a very low fermentable wort, something that may only have the potential to produce about 1%, that lactic acid and that glycerol actually really helps the body because one thing that we've noticed with doing like low gravity, low alcohol worts is the body tends to be lacking.
Mm.
But Philly Sour, having that acidic kick and having that glycerol kind of really helps bring out that body and make it a much more enjoyable beer.
Yeah, because that's some of the challenges I've heard about non-alcoholic or low alcoholic beers
Yeah,
is mouthfeels lacking. And that's the
yeah.
biggest challenge. So, okay, that's interesting. And any insights or thoughts on the industry as a whole, not necessarily beer trends, but just I guess the future of the craft beer in both the states or other regions that you know are quite or intimately know. I don't know. Do you have much sort of exposure to the Australian markets at all? Tell us a bit about your thoughts on the future of craft, maybe in some of the regions that you're well known to.
Sure. At least here in both Canada and the United States, I think craft is at a very healthy position. It's not growing the same way that it was growing like back in the early 2000s or in the mid 2000s, but it's definitely still growing. And I think that we're just going to start seeing a lot more creativity, especially as people are kind of moving away from more traditional aspects of it. I don't think that the traditional aspect will ever go away. Unfortunately, I can't speak for the Australian industry, but I would love to learn more about it. I'm just really upset because I was supposed to go out to Australia this winter, or winter for me, but
Yeah.
to come visit. But yeah, obviously that's not happening anytime
Yeah, I
soon.
think a lot of people's holiday plans have been knocked on the head these last 12 months. But
Yeah.
yeah, I guess the unique position that Australia finds itself in is it has so much more room to grow. I mean,
Hmm.
we're definitely not at the beginning of the rise of craft. A lot of people would say that it's been humming along for a good 10 plus years, just over 10 years now. It's growing rapidly every year now. But what Australia has to learn is from its big brothers like the US in particular about where trends are going, because we always sort of a lot of people have come on the show and said that we have normally found ourselves either between 5 or 10 years behind the US market in terms of beer trends and where the current state of craft beer is, and we tend to soon follow after. But that gap has reduced, and it's almost not quite real time, but it doesn't take long for things to be happening in the US to then start seeing them happen over here. Like you're saying, seltzers and low alcoholic beers, they're all starting to make a big push over here now. But I guess the unique position Australia finds itself in is we've got so much more room to grow, and there's so much more experimentation that for new brewery owners to open up, instead of just saying, oh, we're a brewery that makes good beers, you're starting to see breweries that just make one style of beer, like whether it be just sours, or I'd love to see more Belgian style beers over here, and people taking a bit more of a risk and experimentation with not just the run of the mill pale ales and IPAs, but bringing a different product offering over here. And I'd really like to see that happen. There's just so much more to come, I think, for the Australian market.
Yeah, and from what I know, the little bit that I do know, it's that you guys are just ripe for that. My actually my graduate advisor, he was a research scientist at the Australian Wine Research Institute. He was originally from Adelaide, and the first time when he moved over to the States was the year that I started graduate school. And the first time I took him out to a local Belgian beer hall, he was absolutely blown away by the selection of not just like Belgian beers, but like we had this big old book that you could pick up when you go in. It's like the big beer Bible, and you can just order bottles if you didn't want anything on tap. And one thing that he is really excited to see take off are Brettanomyces beers, and I regret not bringing it up sooner because I could talk a whole lot about that. But Brett beers, non-Saccharomyces Brett beers, that's definitely a growing trend. And when done right, I think that is something that could definitely make a huge impact on the market. Brettanomyces is a different genus of yeast,
Yeah.
so it's completely different from
Yep.
Saccharomyces, and it's considered a spoilage organism. Or for a long time, it was considered a spoilage organism because when it gets into wine, It's very tenacious. It destroys barrels because you just can't get rid of it. But Brett or Brettanomyces species play a big role in those in the flavors of classic UK or British stouts, because it literally means it was first discovered in Britain, so it literally means the British sugar fungus. And it also plays a huge role in the flavor development of lambic style beers. So it's an entirely separate yeast. It's a very slow growing yeast, highly adaptive to nutrient scarce conditions. It tends to just lag behind Saccharomyces in terms of just vigor. And then once the Saccharomyces fermentation starts to stop and die off, that's when Brettanomyces really starts to shine and starts developing all kinds of these esters and fatty acids that, when present in the right amounts, provide just phenomenal taste. You can get tropical flavors from them, like passion fruit, mangoes, but they're also responsible for acetic acid, so they can make like a vinegar-like taste. Off flavors that are often described as like mousy, which is THP. And the best way I can describe that is if you've ever eaten like a bowl of Cheerios and had the milk after all the Cheerios were gone. That's kind of what it tastes like. An off flavor that's kind of smells like Band-Aids or medicinal or phenolic, so like 4-EG. So it's all about picking the right species and treating it right. And this is definitely not something I recommend that new breweries try, especially if they're just focusing on Saccharomyces beers, because like if you get an infection in the rest of your brewery, it's a real pain in the butt to clean up. So it's kind of like stick with one style and
learn your craft first.
Keep things separate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's some really interesting insights there, mate. And I mean, not to play favorites with all the different ingredients that we're talking about, with the hops and malt, but yeast. It is a fascinating topic that I find in the whole brewing process. It's highly complex and so many different unexplored areas that brewers can look into to set themselves apart. And I think that's sort of the theme of today's episode, is how not only understanding the logistics of getting yeast into your brewery, and I know we didn't touch a lot on the contract side. It's like you said, not an area or forte of yours, but I'm glad that we're able to explore the different areas of how yeast can bring success to a brewery's beers. But actually, before we do finish with some closing thoughts, mate, I think you mentioned earlier that you'd like to talk a little bit about the COVID impact that you've seen on the brewing industry.
Yeah, and it has been hard and it has been fast. So I could say thankfully, and I'm very thankful for this, Lallemand wasn't too affected by this, mostly because our biggest sector is baking and food. So we supply a lot of baking yeast and nutritional supplements for basically nutritional yeast for the food industry. But one thing that we have been doing, and one thing that I've seen a lot of positive impact from, is both the brewing and the biofuels and distilled spirits divisions of Lallemand have been helping breweries convert their facilities into facilities that you can make and package hand sanitizer in. Because that's not something that can be just done overnight. It takes planning, and you have to get the proper certification, especially if you're going to start distilling if you've never distilled before. But this has really helped a lot of struggling breweries, especially smaller breweries that had just gotten their start when everything happened, stay afloat. I've seen breweries in upstate New York that have managed to stave off any kinds of layoffs or business shutdowns because they've just been converted into full-time hand sanitizer production, using the pamphlets and the information that our experts are able to provide for them. So I think that this is going to start, or this is going to catalyze a major trend in how breweries are going to approach future projects, because we're just going to see a whole lot of diversification, products of brand offerings, and it's definitely going to be accelerated because of COVID-19. And we're also just going to start seeing like different ways in how beer itself is delivered too. It's going to be a lot easier to get packaged beer now, which is something that many small breweries never really, you don't really consider that when you're first starting out. But if people can't get to you, they can't buy your beer. So we're going to see a whole lot of cottage industries kind of cropping up. I know in the States, there's a big developing industry around the idea of mobile canning facilities, basically an entire canning facility in the back of a big rig semi truck that can come to your brewery and package everything for you on contract. Yeah, so those have been some of the positives that I've seen come out of this, which is great. And that's the other thing too. Like, you develop a good relationship, and I'm going to keep pressing this. You develop a good relationship with your supplier. You develop a good relationship with the company, and in times like these, like they're there to help.
Yeah, perfect. Well, once again, really appreciate you coming on, Avi. You've shared some absolute brilliant advice around that yeast aspect, and we don't need to sort of rehash how important yeast is in the whole brewing process. But anything you'd like to plug or talk about, upcoming things at Lallemand, events, or even I know that you're more regionally based for the US and Canada markets, but we do have some of those sort of audience listening in from recent months. People are tuning in from all parts of the world. So where can people reach out to you if they have any questions?
So I am on LinkedIn. You can definitely reach out to me there, or you can reach me at my work email. So it's just Shayevitz@lallemand.com. So I don't know if you're
I'll put in the show notes for the spelling of your last name. So all good.
Yeah, great. So, please forgive me if it does take a little bit time for me to get back to you. We are very busy these days, but I always try to make it a point to get back to people that contact me with specific questions. And I just love hearing about like what projects people have going on, if they just need any advice for I don't know, yeast nutrients, or what strains to use. Or if you just want to reach out and tell me about that pastry stout you're making.
Yeah, I'd like to hear as well.
As for upcoming events, so Lallemand is always putting on webinars that you can find on the Lallemand website, or at least schedules for that. And then if you missed it, they're pretty good about, the marketing team is very good actually about putting it up on the Lallemand YouTube channel for stuff that has already aired. You can also check out on their Facebook page. I wouldn't know because I am off of Facebook forever.
It's not a bad thing.
yeah, we definitely do stuff through like the IBD, the Master Brewers Association of America. Yeah, a lot of local chapters. So if you're into states, just check out your local chapter. We try to be as involved as we can with each of our sales representatives' regions. So they will be the people to contact about stuff like that. Yeah.
Perfect. So. All right. Well, thanks again, Avi, for coming on the Build Me Brewery podcast. I really appreciate it, mate.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was great. Great just being able to talk about this. So. Yeah.
Well, an hour 20 long. I'm sure we could have talked a lot more about yeast, but we've got to make it digestible for people.
Yeah. Understand.
Perfect, mate. Well, we'll talk again soon, no doubt.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Cheers, mate.
All right. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. That was part 3 and our final episode of the raw materials and ingredient suppliers segment. In our next segment, we discuss beer packaging, where I chat with Managing Director Chris Kelly from East Coast Canning to discuss the role of mobile canning services to the brewing industry. And I also meet with Nick Becker from Convoy Kegs to discuss keg rental and leasing options for breweries. As always, if you are liking the podcast so far and find the content useful, Please give us a follow and rating on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, follow us on all our social media handles, as well as visiting our website, www.billmeabrewery.com.au, and much more complimentary content will be coming your way if you sign up to our mailing list. I'm Chris Hayton, your host, and this is the Bill Me a Brewery podcast.